Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's video we're going to be talking about dopamine. So to memorize my drugs in anesthesia, I have this plan that I follow and I'm going to share with you guys. So I start with the classification, the mechanism of action that helps me determine what is the drug used for. I have the adverse effect versus complication, the special consideration in anesthesia, the interaction with other drugs, how is the drug metabolized, and what is the route of administration or elimination, and the last but not the least, how do I handle the toxicity? How do I even know that I'm in the presence of a toxicity? So let's talk about dopamine. So dopamine, we're going to start with its classification. So dopamine first, it's secreted in the brain. So the brain makes its own dopamine in our central nervous system. And that dopamine acts as a neurotransmitter because when that dopamine level in the central nervous system, in the midbrain in particular, the substantia nigra produces the dopamine. When the levels are low, we are in the presence of Parkinson's disease. And when the levels are high, we have schizophrenia. But this dopamine we're going to be talking about is the dopamine that is a catecholamine. So dopamine is also an endogenous catecholamine that the body makes, and it acts in two different ways. So the one that we administer as a drug, it acts as a mix and catecholamine. Why I say mix? Because it has a direct and indirect action. So in a direct action, dopamine is going to act directly on the adrenergic receptor, on the receptor to stimulate them. But indirectly, dopamine is going to stimulate the release of norepinephrine and is a direct precursor of norepinephrine. So it helps with the release of norepinephrine. So every time that you give dopamine to your patient, keep in mind that it's going to act in those two different ways. So on the classification, we're going to put here, so dopamine is secreted in the CNS, in the midbrain. It acts as a neurotransmitter. When the levels are down, it's Parkinson. When the levels are up, it's in schizophrenia. And we're also going to add that dopamine is an endogenous catecholamine, just like epi or norepinephrine, right? And it acts in both ways. It acts directly on the adrenergic receptor or indirectly. So this is the main classification of dopamine. Now, what is its mechanism of action? How does dopamine act in the body? So here, we're going to forget about this part because we are talking now about administered dopamine. We are not talking about the one secreted in the central nervous system. So the mechanism of action of dopamine, because it's an endogenous catecholamine, most of them are not liposoluble. So it's not going to cross the CNS membrane, the blood-brain barrier. So all the effect of dopamine you see when you administer the medicine is going to reflect the peripheral nervous system action because it cannot cross the central nervous system, right? So mechanism of action directly, dopamine is going to stimulate. I'm going to change this marker. So in a directly manner, dopamine is going to stimulate the receptor D1, D2, beta 1, alpha 1, and alpha 2. So all these receptors are going to be stimulated by dopamine, and indirectly we see that it's going to increase the release of norepinephrine because it's a direct precursor of norepinephrine. When I say direct precursor, is that you need dopamine in order to make norepinephrine. It's actually a chain of reaction. For the purpose of this video, we are not going to talk about it. We're going to limit ourselves to a direct precursor of norepinephrine. So it increases the release of norepinephrine in our body. Norepinephrine is also a catecholamine that acts on different receptors. Now, directly stimulating this action, dopamine 1 and dopamine 2 are specifically based in 3 body systems, right? Those dopamine receptors are found in the heart, they are found in the kidney, and in the mesenteric artery. Mesenteric artery, like in our bowels, if I can say so. Now, the beta 1 receptors are going to be found in main on the heart. The alpha 1 receptors activation is going to be on the vessel. And the alpha 2 receptors, we talk about this. Now, let's go back to the dopamine 1, dopamine 2 receptor. So because dopamine is going to activate this receptor on these 3 places, so dopamine is going to increase the renal function, right? And the only way dopamine is going to act on the dopamine 1 and 2 is if you give it at low dose. So only at low dose, we're going to have this effect on the heart, kidney, and mesenteric artery. So at this low dose, what are you going to have? The low dose is going to be from 0.5 to 3 mics per kg per minute. So if you give dopamine at this low dose, dopamine is going to act here and vasodilate, right? Mainly on the kidneys. So dopamine is going to vasodilate the afferent arteriole, because when you have your kidneys here, this is the afferent arteriole and this is the efferent, the one that leaves and the one that comes. So if dopamine vasodilate here, you have increase in your glomerular filtration here, water goes out and sodium goes out, right? So this is a great action when you have a patient that needs an increased cardiac output, but who has a sluggish renal function, because this is going to empower that renal function. So we're going to call it renal protectant. Renal protectant. Now keep in mind that we are not, in clinical practice, we are not giving dopamine only for this renal protectant action. We have so many drugs that can act at those receptors and do the same job without the dopamine complications. So dopamine is going to mainly given clinically for its beta 1 receptor activation. So on the beta 1 here, now the dose is going to be different. It's going to be from 3 to 10 mics per kg per minute. So this is why we want to give dopamine, because of this. We are looking for this action in clinical use. So on your beta 1 receptor activation, you're going to have an increase in cardiac output. Remember, beta 1 is mainly located on the heart. You're going to have an increase in heart rate, and your MAP is also going to increase, which is the action that we are looking in ICUs, right? We want all these actions. Now, at the beta 1 activation, it's also going to act as an indirect. So because it acts as an indirect, it's going to also increase your norepinephrine release, which is going to empower all these actions, right? So you're going to have increased cardiac output, increased heart rate, increased MAP. We are in a great position. And a bonus to that, at beta 1 receptor, you still have some effect of your renal protective action. So you still have renal protective action here. which is great because you increase the heart ability to pump. At the same time, you increase the rate of function. We are all happy. Now, activation of alpha-1 receptors, I'm gonna put it here. So alpha-1 receptor are gonna be activated at higher dose. So if you go from 10 to 20 mics per kg per minute, you are actually activating your alpha-1 receptor. We don't want this action clinically because at this dose, you are losing your renal protecting action. You still have some of the beta-1 action, but you have an intensive vasoconstriction. Intense vasoconstriction. And because it's so intense, you have now your reflex bradycardia because your heart said, oh, it's too much constriction. So you losing that power of heart contractility because of cardiac output is going to go down. You are in the midst of the reflex bradycardia. So you're losing that cardiac output. So we don't want this. And if you go even higher dose, so if you go like more than 20 mics per kg per minute, you actually reversing this renal protecting action. Now you are in the middle of chaos. You never want this. So the stimulation of alpha-2 is gonna decrease your insulin release. Remember, alpha-2 stimulation decrease your insulin release, and this is gonna put you at a situation of hyperglycemia, so be aware. Now that we saw the mechanism of action of dopamine, why are you using dopamine in an acute setting or in anesthesia? Dopamine has great function when you use it at beta-1 clinical use because it's going to increase your cardiac output. So in situation that you have a decrease in cardiac output, like congestive heart failure or sepsis, you want to use that. But keep in mind, because if you give dopamine continuously, you are depleting your store of norepinephrine. And if you are depleting your norepinephrine, this indirect action cannot work anymore. So that's why we say clinically this indirect action is irrelevant, because if you have a sepsis, if you have a chronic heart failure, you don't have enough store of dopamine, of norepinephrine to be released. So this action is going to be voided. But so dopamine is going to be used in septate to have that increase in cardiac output, increase in MAP, and keeping those renal protective action. So now let's look at the adverse effect versus complication of dopamine. Dopamine has a lot of adverse effect that makes it not the first line treatment like in heart failures or in sepsis. Let's talk about it. So mainly in dopamine is known to give sinus tach. So when you give your dopamine, be ready for this sinus arrhythmia because it's very potent at giving that, even more than epinephrine. So when you give dopamine, you want to check your EKGs. Now also, dopamine depresses the baroreceptor in the carotid, so the body doesn't act reflexively when you have a ventilation depression. And it decreases also your oxygen saturation. There's a bunch of mechanisms involved, but you just want to keep that in mind. So every time that in anesthesia or in acute care settings you are giving dopamine, you want to make sure that the patient is highly oxygenated, and you also want to check your ABGs. So vent depressor, so you want to keep that person oxygenated and check the ABGs. And this is also the reason why you don't want to give dopamine when a patient has a serious right heart failure, because of these oxygenation issues. And also, dopamine is going to increase your intraocular pressure. Yeah, dopamine does that. So you want to make sure that you check the patient. If your patient has a history of intraocular pressure, you want to make sure you really check that interaction before you give dopamine. Now, dopamine, because it activates the receptor dopamine 2, it's gonna give us nausea and vomiting. Now, as anesthesia provider, nausea and vomiting increases the risk of your patient to aspirate. And if the patient aspirate, you don't have that adequate ventilatory exchange, right? So you want to make sure that you have that side effect in mind before you administer dopamine. And the drugs that act on dopamine receptor and antagonize these are going to block the nausea and vomiting, but also decreasing the renoprotecting effect of dopamine. So just keep that in mind. So these are the serious complications of dopamine that you want to have in hand. Now, the special consideration, like I said before, right heart failure, increased intraocular pressure, the drugs that act on dopamine antagonists. We have drugs like metoclopramide, and we also have haloperidol. These drugs are given for nausea and vomiting, but by giving them, you're actually antagonizing dopamine at the receptor D2. So also be aware. Spatial interaction. We're gonna get to that. Metabolism of dopamine. So dopamine is mainly metabolized, like all the catecholamine, because it's a catecholamine, it's mainly metabolized by the liver and the kidneys, and it's metabolized by two enzymes, the monoamine oxidase and also the catecholamine O methyltransferase. So if your patient have liver failure or a kidney failure, you want to adjust the dose because you know that your dopamine is gonna go through this pathway to be eliminated out of his body. Now, because it's metabolized by these two enzymes, a duration of action is very short, and this is the reason why we give dopamine as an IV infusion. So his half-life is short, so you want to give it as an IV continuous infusion. Toxicity. So like all the pressors, you can have infiltration, right? If you have infiltration, you want to treat it with phentolamine. Phentolamine is gonna antagonize the alpha 1 and alpha 2 receptor. And let me write down the drug. Phentolamine. So it's gonna antagonize the alpha 1 and alpha 2 receptor and try to amend to that powerful vasoconstriction that the alpha 1 stimulation of dopamine gives you. So this is not a whole set about dopamine, but it's actually a really good condensation to actually know a little bit about the drug. Now I encourage you to go in the books to find more information, but this is what I got for you guys today. If you watch the video, you have any question or suggestion, please drop down below. And if you have any comment, do the same. Like, share, and subscribe, and thank you so much.